Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
and me, Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Our featured guest today is Cam Cobb. Cam Cobb is a professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of Windsor and a rock journalist. Cobb's writing has appeared in such magazines as Record Collector, Shindig, and Ugly Things. His liner notes for Skip Spence's single, Rock and Roll Band, accompanied the release in 2019. Cobb co-directed Buskin in the Subway for the Windsor International Film Festival, and he co-produced OAR, a short documentary on Skip Spence. His books include What's Big and Purple and Lives in the Ocean, The Moby Grape Story, and Weighted Down, The Complicated Life of Skip Spence. Welcome, Cam.
Thank you.
So you're both a professor and a rock journalist. Which one came first, and how did you get into writing about rock and popular music?
Oh, great. Okay. I was an education professor first, and I was an educator first. So after I finished my undergrad, which I did at Queen's many, many years ago, I took a TESOL course. I had a friend who had taught in another country, and I became interested in that. And so I went to Korea in January, in the winter of '96. And I worked in education for years. After that, I did my Bachelor of Education after I came back, also worked in language schools before doing that. And so doing grad school work in the early 2000s, I delved into narratives and lived experiences of folks, mainly folks interacting with the special education system in Ontario. And that sort of came out of my experience as an educator. I saw that there were certain issues, issues like regarding access, for instance. And so I started doing research in that area. And after finishing my PhD in 2010, I started working at the University of Windsor. And it was during my first sabbatical that I started doing this project on Moby Grape. And since then, I've done a lot of writing on the band. So I guess I've been writing on Moby Grapes since late 2016. And so I've developed relationships with folks in and around the band that have lasted a long time. So like yesterday and today I text with some of his kids and his sister, Skip Spence. And So it wasn't first, but the kind of things that I do in rock journalism are not unlike the things that I do in education research.
So today we're talking about Weighted Down, The Complicated Life of Skip Spence. It's your second book on the history of Moby Grape. Why two books? Did you find more information to fill after you had published the first, or
Yeah,
was it just too much for one volume?
I could easily do more, actually. So what happened was I wrote the initial book on Moby Grape in started in very late 2016 and it was published in 2018. And I initially wrote actually just a self-contained story of Moby Grape's reunion. This was the first time that we saw a rock band doing a reunion, and this was in 1971, in the spring and summer of 1971. And I was really intrigued by that period in the band's history. So I wrote this self-contained book about the reunion. And then I was pitching to different publishers. And when I was successful with Jawbone, they then said, but you have to tell the other part of the story too. You have to tell everything that happened before the reunion. So I actually wrote kind of a second book in a way. Like I wrote from the origin to the reunion as a sort of book two. There was a second part of that first book on Moby Grape. And when I finished it, I started writing articles on the band and I was doing new interviews. So the first article that I wrote after the book came out was for Ugly Things magazine. And I was a rookie for writing magazine articles at that time. I had done, like lots of journal articles and book chapters in like the academic area, but this was something totally different. And again, it's like similar, you're using the same kind of skills, but it is a little different though. And so I wrote this article about Moby Grape's fourth album, which Skip isn't on. One of his songs that he co-wrote is on it, called Truly Fine Citizen. And I wrote that in probably April, May of 2018, right after the book came out. And then I just enjoyed writing a lot of magazine articles about the band, doing new interviews along the way. And I made a short film with a friend of mine, Chris DeStallo, in 2019. And Chris and I were doing some filming, and one of Skip's sons came and stayed with me. And he was going to perform in a dinner theater with Don Stevenson, who's a member of Moby Grape, who lives in Toronto. And Chris came to do filming with me, and Omar came to visit and perform. And one night, Omar and I were talking, and Omar said that he wishes there was a book on his dad. And that's when I got the idea, like, whoa, this is something that can be done. Absolutely. And so it allowed me to revisit the Moby Grape story. I learned new things. So like you mentioned, absolutely, there was new information that I could include. And I could write this book that is focusing on the life of Skip Spence, but there's almost like a Trojan horse biography of Moby Grape, second version of Moby Grape's story inside the Skip Spence story. And so it allowed me to revisit that.
Okay, well, for our audience, here's kind of the Cliff Notes version of Skip's life. He started out as a happy-go-lucky rock star. He kind of got into drugs. Along the way, he had some sort of interaction with a mystery woman who may have been a witch, and he wound up in a mental hospital. Then he got out and cut a respected solo album. Then he faded away and then later became a rock and roll cult hero. Would you say his story is operatic, or is it more of a Greek tragedy like Icarus? How would you characterize it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that we can say is, so Skip's life, he had a lot of good fortune going up to the point where he had that breakdown in Manhattan in early June of 1968. So this is a guy, he's born in Windsor. His dad is a musician, Jock Spence, very talented musician, playing the piano like a crooner, a great crooner and great piano player. I have some of the recordings that Skip's sister had sent me. And so Skip grew up with that, and they ended up moving down to the States. And initially, it was in the Ohio. Well, it was Detroit initially, and then the Ohio area, and then down in Phoenix. And Skip's grandfather worked in border control, and his grandfather had he died of tuberculosis. So I wonder if what propelled the grandfather to move down to Phoenix was the dry air, so that it's a little bit healthier for him. And so he moved down, and he had a second wife and younger kid. And so Skip's dad was from his first group of kids with his first wife. And so Grandpa Alex, or I think they called him Granddad Alex, moved down to Phoenix. And so Skip's dad, Jock, and the family eventually moved down to Phoenix, and they were there for a lot of the 1950s. And that's when Skip got into rock and roll, and he loved rock and roll. And they ended up moving to the South Bay area. And so by the early 60s, they're in the South Bay area. And this is a time of the folk revival. And so pre-folk rock. And so this is like the kind of era like when Dylan is starting out. And so Skip is playing in folk clubs, little folk clubs. And he's playing with people who are not famous yet, but they are going to be famous. Future members of the Grateful Dead, future members of the Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, David Crosby. All these people are circulating in these clubs at that time. Skip has a lot of good luck, and he ends up rehearsing with this band. It's a proto version of Quicksilver Messenger Service. And so he's rehearsing with this band. They're going to become like this talented band. And at that point, and it's at this club called the Matrix, which is co-owned by one of the members of the Jefferson Airplane, which is just a month old at that time, that band. And the guy is Marty Balin, and he sees Skip, and he is really um, impressed by this guy's energy. And so Skip immediately got recruited into the Jefferson Airplane, and he has to switch to drums in order to join the band. And he sort of had to think about that because Skip was very natural as a frontman in the band. And so he became a drummer. So we've got a songwriting drummer in the Jefferson Airplane, a band flush with songwriters. And he plays at this time, we have Bill Graham, who was managing the San Francisco Mime Troupe, and this is a sort of activist theater group that sometimes pushed limits, and they got in trouble with the law. And so when they started getting in trouble, he would organize benefits. And one time he organized a benefit at the Fillmore, and this was the first time that we have a rock ballroom show. And so Skip was right there at ground zero of rock ballroom shows. Prior to that, sound systems and the kind of experience that people would have at concerts was a lot more haphazard. Like you would have bands play like bowling alleys, that kind of thing. And so the rock ballroom, now we've got like, let's get a really good sound system. Let's get an amazing lighting system. It's going to be a kind of almost like a church experience that people will have. And so Skip is going through all these experiences, living his life in a very carefree and sometimes careless way, but things are bouncing the right way for him. And so it's working out, and he gets recruited into the Jefferson Airplane. They record their first album in December of 65 and early 66. Skip gets kicked out of the band. Story is that he disappeared, went on a little holiday in Mexico without telling people, and he got kicked out of the band. But what happens? A couple months later, co-founds Moby Grape, and this is a super talented band. There's like a lineup of record companies who want to sign this amazing band with 5 singer-songwriters. And so with Skip, I don't know, like he did Fly Too Close to the Sun. He had the way that he lived his life led him to create the kind of art that he created, where he's experimenting, he's doing a lot of different things, and he had luck on his side for a while, and then all of a sudden it wasn't on his side anymore. And he ended up in Bellevue Hospital in 1968 in June. And so you have to remember, this is like right at the time that RFK was assassinated. And Skip was in Bellevue right at the same time as the person who shot Andy Warhol. I forget her name now, but he was right at that time. So there's a lot of stuff going on. And Skip had his breakdown in New York, and the guys in the band didn't know what to do. And the initial thought was that if we can get Skip some kind of help, that he could get cleaned up and he could get back on track, because at that time he was talking about leaving the bands. That was his plan. And unfortunately, it didn't work out. We don't know what exactly happened in Bellevue, because it could have been more damage that was done there. He could have had electroshock therapy. It could have had a negative impact on him. And then, of course, 1968, what kind of support, outpatient support, is he going to get when he's out? Also, what kind of support does his wife have access to, which is nil at the time? And so, like, there's no kind of support system. He cuts this incredible album in Nashville because he's in New York. He gets out of Bellevue. He goes back home to California. They drive together with the kids to Nashville. He records this album where he plays every instrument, which is a cult classic album now. And that's when the luck ran out for Skip. And, we would say today, he was self-medicating after that. He was on his meds for a time. He was not consistently on his meds, though. And so that's when things didn't go so well for him. Even when things were not going so well for him, there was still always like the chance that things would work out. I mean, if Skip was like a key figure in getting the Doobie Brothers together, so he could have been a member of the Doobie Brothers. Moby Grape's Reunion is an interesting album. So I don't know, maybe Greek tragedy. I mean, he had all these, I guess, maybe heroic traits or these characteristics, and yet there were some flaws. Like, he was careless and carefree, I think I say it in the book, like he was careless and carefree, but he was not uncaring. He cared deeply, but he didn't always make healthy decisions.
So that solo album that you mentioned, or is also a big part of the mythology surrounding Skip Spence because he
Yeah.
recorded it immediately after that stay at Bellevue. So what is it, the special quality that makes it such a cult classic, as you mentioned?
So it's interesting, like Skip's or um preceded that first solo album that Paul McCartney did, where Paul plays all the instruments. It's just called McCartney. And so he kind of predicted that pathway that became possible for musicians later on. But or which oscillates from it, you've got like really happy songs and silly songs, but you've also got and fun songs, but you've also got deeply serious songs where this guy is exposing his heart to everybody. And so it's actually very personal in some ways on the level that the John Lennon Plastic Ono Band album is. That one that has, the song Mother, and it's got a lot of great songs on it. But or it can be like that. And so it's like a very, um, it's not the kind of album that you're going to play at a party or that you're going to hear in a cafe. But, if you are listening at night and you're on your own, this is like a great album to listen to sometimes if you're in the right mood. And so um, I think the fact that it is so deeply personal, this guy's opening his heart up to everybody and doing it in a way where he's playing all the instruments. This is the only guy who's in the studio apart from engineers. And those engineers were handpicked to work with him on that album too by the co-producer, David Rubinson, who worked with Moby Grape. And so we have this deeply personal statement. So kind of like the John Lennon element of Plastic Ono Band album that he did. But then we got the fact that this guy's doing everything on his own. He wrote these songs, um, when he was in Bellevue during his 5 month stay there. And he records them on his own after he gets out. And so I think that there's a lot there, and there's a lot that intrigues people about Moby Grape as well. And so I think there's a lot of these things will draw people to listen. But at the end, of course, like it has to be good music, interesting lyrics and meaningful music and lyrics. And so like it has these things. And so I think that's what draws it in, or draws in its audience. And it's not that it's a million seller, but it has significantly impacted people. Robert Plant has recorded songs from this album and back a lot of, Robin Hitchcock and Tom Waits, a lot of very talented people have gone to these songs and recorded them.
And yeah, and you're leading right into my next question. I mean, certainly a lot of people hung in there with Skip through his ups and downs. So he must have been very charismatic. The band members, you mentioned David Rubinson, but also he did inspire a lot of people to either hang out with him or record his music. And I'm just going to read a few of the names that you list in the book: David Crosby, Paul Kantner, Janis Joplin, Aretha Franklin, as you mentioned, Robert Plant, Sly Stone, Steve Winwood, Chrissie Hynde. I mean, there was just all kinds of people involved in this book. How did you, as a writer, keep them all straight? Did you have like a murder wall with photos and string and stuff, or?
Right. I have a lot of charts and a lot of lists, and I would always try and immerse myself. For each chapter, I would try to immerse myself in what's going on. As I researched the book, I interviewed people in the order in which they appeared in Skip's life for the most part. And so I spent the first couple months talking a lot with Skip's sister, Sherry, his younger sister. And like I continuously talked to her, but I would first talk to people as they appeared in his life. And so um, the folks who were in those early folk days, I talked to them early on, and then I went back to people in Moby Grape, and then people from his life in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And so it was lots of charts and lists to keep track of it. And there were people, of course, who were drawn to Skip to collaborate with him. And then there were just people who were in his circle because he was in San Francisco, which was an absolutely vibrant place in the late 60s. There was a lot going on there. And they would have interacted with these people, just like almost like, I guess, coworkers in a way, right? And they're, these are people who are playing in the same clubs, and then they'll go to the same place afterwards to jam. And so when Moby Grape was just starting out, they played in this dry docked ferry boat up in Marin County in Sausalito, and it was called the Ark. And the Ark, which used to be a ferry, was this club, which was a very popular spot for people to go after shows. So people would watch shows. And remember, again, this is like the time when the ballrooms are just coming out of the gates and exploding. And so people will be at shows like the Avalon, which was run by Chet Helms, and the Fillmore, run by Bill Graham. And then they would go across the Golden Gate Bridge up to Sausalito and go to the Ark. And Moby Grape was they were actually playing their songs over and over again and arranging their songs. And Moby Grape had their songs were tightly arranged. And so it was, I think, a magical time. And the Grape had this diversity within them because you had Peter Lewis, who came from Hollywood. His mom was Loretta Young, and he was really good at finger picking. So he was somebody who I guess would be a little bit more like Roger McGuinn or Donovan kind of style a little bit to him. And then you had somebody like Bob Mosley who could just belt out tunes, and he was just powerful and soul and blues. And he was from San Diego. And he had Don Stevenson and Jerry Miller, who were from the Pacific Northwest. They're from the Seattle area, and they were playing in sort of like R&B trios, and they Bob Mosley and Jerry Miller and Don Stevenson had played a lot of clubs, and so they had gotten really tight. And Peter played some clubs too, and Skip had that folk background. So he had this band that blended a lot of different talents. And so, people weren't calling it Americana back then, but it was like Americana, and they could play it um, with feeling. And so they're playing folk, country, blues, soul, rock and roll. They had some psychedelic numbers, but they weren't like really heavy duty psychedelic. So they had a lot of diversity and absolute talent. And so I think a lot of people were drawn to that. And Skip was, I've said to some people before, he's kind of like John Belushi. Like, if this person is on the screen, your eyes go to this person. He is just absolutely compelling. And so if you watch any of the live footage, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of live video of Moby Grape. And but if you see any of it, you can see this guy was absolutely on fire when he was performing. Um, he actually spun himself off the stage a couple times, and so he was a live wire on stage. And so I can see absolutely why people would be drawn to him, and to collaborate with him, or to just like be around him, or to experience the music that he was creating.
Surrounded by all those talented people, incredibly talented people, was he an actual musical genius? And if so, what's the core of that? What kind of made him different from all of those other great people, do you think?
So so this all also comes back to his personality. This person who would take risks and try things out and would just dive into them. And he would do this with his life, and he would do this musically. And he was also not somebody who was really like setting up this long path for himself. He did things in the spur of the moment. Like, I think that his exit from Jefferson Airplane came quickly, and his intended exit, when he said he was leaving Moby Grape, I think that was very quick. So he did things on the spur of the moment. And so that led to some of the problems in his life, but that also led to the magic of the things that he was creating. So you have this person who's absolutely loves folk music and starts doing folk music. And then in the summer of 65, after Dylan went electric, like a lot of people, there were some people who were put off when Dylan went electric, and some people embraced it, and Skip embraced it. So Skip formed a rock and roll band, and they would go to Tahoe and play in Tahoe. Very short term, but he had this band called the Mains in the summer of 65. And then he's back into a little bit of the folk scene with the Jefferson Airplane. But he's also writing and ready to be a front man in the band, which he later was in Moby Grape. But he could write songs. So he co-wrote Dark Magic, which is this amazing psychedelic song that Moby Grape did. He can do these tightly arranged short pieces like Rounder, which didn't go on the first album. I don't know why it didn't go on the first album. It's a great song. But he did these other ones like Indifference and Omaha. And then for the second album, he does a song like Seeing, which is it blows you away when you listen to this song. And Seeing predicts the kind of work that he did on Or, which is so deeply personal. But at the same time, he does this song called Just Like Gene Autry, which is a kind of like in the style of his dad's old music. He does this song called Funky Tonk, which is kind of like a funny country rock kind of thing. And then he does this song called Motorcycle Irene, and which is another kind of funny song. He does a song that didn't make it on the album was called You Can Do Anything, which was about how you could be a free spirit. And so he can do all these different styles of music. I think he was very intuitive in how he would do things. And so, it wasn't like he's methodically planning it out. Very intuitive, just jump into things in the moment. And he would drop things quickly. And so like certain songs he would just like drop and not do. And so that was, I think, a part of the magic that he had. An incredibly energetic performer as well. And yeah, I think those are some of the big things with Skip. So I think it was like very intuitive, the kind of talent that he had.
As Cam Cobb, the music fan, what do you most appreciate about Skip's work? What speaks to you personally?
Um, so the first Moby Grape album that I got was their first one. And actually, I brought this book up from my basement for today's show. This is what introduced me to Moby Grape, and this was when I was a teenager, or around the time I was 20. We didn't have the internet back then. This is like late 80s, early 90s, and so this is the Rolling Stone album guide. It's the second edition, the one with the blue cover, and there's this intriguing entry on Moby Grape, and based on that entry, I picked up their first album, and this was at a time where um, getting hard to find albums was tricky. So you had to go. I grew up in Toronto, so you go down to the big flagship stores at Yonge and Dundas, like Sam the Record Man, and I got their first album. And when that first album kicked into gear, the first track on it is a song called "Hey Grandma," and they're singing about these hippies who wore like sort of granny dresses, and they're singing the song "Hey Grandma." You're so young, your old man is just a boy. And this song is just so fun and energetic, tightly arranged, very short, so different from all these long jam songs that other bands were doing at the time. I knew right away, like, this is a special band. And so I start to track down their albums at that point. And so Skip had a couple songs on that opening album. Um, I guess like we could say two and a third, because he wrote Indifference on his own, and he wrote Omaha on his own, and he co-wrote Someday with Don Stevenson and Jerry Miller. And so right away, I knew this is a talented band. So my first discovery of Skip is through Moby Grape, and it's such a talented band with amazing songs that are quite different from what's going on around them because they're so short and tightly arranged. And you've got the diversity of songs on the album. They're predicting country rock way ahead of when, it becomes big with the Eagles. And so after that, I got more into Skip's individual music and discovered, like, okay, so what's Skip's music? And then I go into like his Jefferson Airplane music because he was on their first album as a full member, and he's a guest on their second album. Their second album is Surrealistic Pillow, and he wrote the lead-off single to that album. So his exit from the band was warm, like it wasn't nasty or anything because he's on the next album as a songwriter and a guest performer. And so then I discovered that music. And then, of course, Or is like, as I mentioned before, it's this very moving album. It can be very fun and light and silly in parts, but it can also be very dark in parts. But it's all this is this person being very open and honest. And so I guess those are some of the big things. Skip also, another thing to remember is that when Moby Grape reunited in 1971, Skip plays on two songs on that album, and he wrote one song on the album, and he's playing the koto, Japanese instruments. And so this is a guy who might have explored world music had his career gone differently at that time. I did, as I was doing the book, I made as a kind of thought experiment, like what could his career have looked like if he had gotten back on track in 1971 instead of really going off track. And this is a guy, he could have gone back to folk music. He could have gone back to his friends in the Jefferson Airplane and collaborated with some of them. And the Jefferson Airplane had like an offshoot band called Hot Tuna, and he could have collaborated with some of these guys. And he could have explored world music. He was actually trying to write a kind of rock opera about the Book of Revelation in 1970. And so he could have done something like that. He could have also done music from the 1940s, like he did that song just like Gene Autry on Moby Grape's second album, and so he could have like done maybe a whole album of those old kinds of songs. Harry Nilsson actually did that a few years later, which kind of predicted when Linda Ronstadt went back and did an album of standards. And so Skip could have done all these different things. So this guy who was um, he created a lot of great music, and it was in a very short period of time because Jefferson Airplane first went in the studio to record that first album in December of 1965, and Skip made his solo album in December of 1968. So in 3 years, he's on Jefferson Airplane's first two albums. He's on Moby Grape's first two albums as a full member, and he's on their third album as the one song that he contributed that was a kind of leftover. It was a great, absolutely phenomenal song. It's kind of the highlight of the album, actually, and it's at the last song, I think, on the album. And um, then he made Or, his solo album. So in 3 years, he did so much incredible music, and yet you're still thinking about what else he could have done, knowing that he had all these different possible pathways that he could have explored.
That is epic. So what are you writing now? What you working on for the future?
Um, so So sometimes it's like Al Pacino in Godfather 3 where he says like they keep pulling me back in, right? So I wrote a bunch of articles about Moby Grape in between the Moby Grape book and the Skip book. And the Skip book took a while to do. It took about 5 years to do, actually. It took a long time. Um, COVID kind of slowed me down, and but during that time, as I was doing the Moby Grape book, I got some Facebook messages, and they're from a guy called Bobby Anders. And he mentioned that he was suggested to get in touch with me, and he's trying to figure out what to do with his dad's music. And Bobby Anders is the nephew of Skip's best man, Billy Dean Anders. And so I worked with the Anders family, and a friend who's a magazine editor, Mike Stacks at Ugly Things, suggested connecting with this record company, Garrison, and particularly Alex Carrero at Garrison. And Garrison had already been in touch with Bobby. And so I was working with Bobby and Garrison and the Anders family and the surviving members of Billy Dean. Billy Dean was Skip's best man, surviving members of his band, Weird Harold, to help set up the release of the album. And so I worked on and off for, I guess it was like 2.5 years, I guess almost 3 years, like 2.5 years on that project. And that album has just come out. I wrote a long magazine piece about Weird Harold's history, and it was starting off with a skeleton. I went to newspaper.com and like went through trying to find, okay, where can we pinpoint concerts that they played? Because some concerts, they're not going to be in newspapers, even smaller local ones. And so some gigs won't be, we'll never figure out what some of the gigs were, but okay, let's try and see what we can pinpoint. And so I pinpoint the history of Weird Harold as best as I could. And then the nephew had all these tapes, and he's sending me photos of things and sending me some things to listen to. And so I worked on that project and wrote this long article. In 2024, I actually got in touch with a surviving member who I was unable to figure out who this person was. It was sort of the name was kind of written down in a little messy way on one of the tape boxes. And so figured out this person, tracked him down, and then actually he was one of the original members of that band, so got the full origin story of that band. It was a lot of detective work. Yeah, so I worked on that. I wrote this 11,000 word article. I wrote the liner notes for the album. I wrote like a little sort of prequel for the articles as a teaser that came out last summer. And so those things came out. And so I'm working on now compiling this into like a longer book. And that will have some photos in it because I've got like notebooks of Billy Dean that I'm borrowing from the nephew, which are going to be that would be in the book that you can see this person's handwriting, which is very nice for people to see. And so Billy Dean has this interesting story as well. And he was connected to Skip because they played the folk clubs together, and they were a duo who played the folk clubs. So there's some photos I think of them in the Skip book, and Skip's first son, Aaron's middle name is, I believe, Dean, which is after Billy Dean's dad, because they used to hang out at Billy Dean's house a lot. And Billy Dean was with Skip when Skip met his wife, is when he met Patricia. And Skip and Billy Dean played together after Skip left Bellevue and after Orr came out. They had a band together and they didn't, unfortunately, not that we know of any recordings, but they performed together. And Billy Dean very sadly died of an overdose in 1970. And so working on moving that sort of set of articles into a longer book, but that would be a much shorter book than the Skip book. It might be 40,000 words.
So much happened in such a short period of time in
Yeah.
that era.
Yeah.
Wow, crazy. So, would you like to read a bit from the weighted down book for our audience?
For sure. Yeah, I'd be delighted to. So this is the book here. This is Skip. This is late 60s photo. So I'll just read from the intro here, the prologue, which is called Myth and True. So there's a foreword that Robin Spence wrote. Robin is Skip's daughter-in-law, Omar's wife, and Omar's the person who came to my house that time when he was going to perform with Dawn. And so the story kind of started with Omar. The end of the book is a quote from Omar, because I wanted to end the story with Omar's words too. But anyway, I'll read this prologue, Myth and True. He was almost the guitarist of Quicksilver Messenger Service. He could have been a Doobie Brother. He was the drummer of the Jefferson Airplane. And he most definitely co-founded Moby Grape back during that season of possibilities, the summer of '66. At that point, Alexander Skip Spence was a psychedelic poet of the Bay Area, an impish, happy-go-lucky rock star. Then, as the summer of love dawned, he'd stormed on the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival like a man on fire. Moby Grape's debut album had just been released, and they were garnering critical praise. But he didn't stay with his bandmates for long. By the next summer, he was gone, locked up in New York City's Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital. The story goes he tried to attack two of the band members with an axe. According to popular legend, Skip Spence hopped on a motorcycle in December '68 after release from the prison ward at Bellevue and rode all the way down to Nashville, Tennessee, in his pajamas no less. Arriving in Music City, he reputedly got off the motorcycle, swept into Columbia Records studio, and recorded his first and last solo album, accompanied only by himself and with no other musicians. With the new decade fast approaching, Orr came to vinyl in the spring of '69, just months after Skip's own release from hospital. On its first pressing, it sold only 700 copies and was long believed to be Columbia's worst-selling album. But now, after decades of lingering in out-of-print banishment, Orr has classic status. You can even find it in a deluxe box set version, which I recommend. And that was it. Spence was done with rock and roll, done with the music business. From that moment, he'd only make fleeting cameo appearances at gigs and on other artists' albums. In the '70s and '80s, he spent time in mental wards, halfway houses, and jails, or lived on the street. After losing his children for decades, he was reconciled with them in the 1990s, only to become terminally ill. Shortly before he passed away, Skip Spence made one last recording for an X-Files tie-in album, and it was reportedly rejected for being too spooky. For the X-Files? Really? Not all of this can be true, though, can it? Well, some of it is and some of it isn't. Skip Spence's life was like his lyric, Myth and True. To untangle the myth from the truth, we'll need to trek through the narrative of his life, riding the turbulence along the way. To get to a starting point, we need to travel back to post-war Canada in the city of Windsor, province of Ontario, south of the Detroit River. which isn't technically a river actually, but it's called a river.
Detroit, the strait.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yep.
So, Cam Cobb, thank you so much for joining us today to talk about Weighted Down: The Complicated Life of Skip Spence.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.